Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So you better strap in because this video is probably going to last a while. So we are in the middle of our champion ranking video series that I do twice a year, typically in June and December. And we already did the 2022 champion rankings, 2021 champion rankings, ranked up all the MCOC classes, did Mystic and Skill class top 10s. Today we are doing Tech class. And that means that we will still have to do Science, Cosmic, and Mutant, and then the overall total list. So here we can see that the old Tech top list started with Ghost, went to Warlock, Ultron, Guillotine 2099, Guardian, Hallowster, Nimrod, because he was very new at the time, Penny Parker, Solar Centurion, and Nebula. Now, most of these champions found their way back on the list. Obviously, order of these has changed. So we better get to describing exactly why, what has changed, why I changed their placement, which newcomer obviously has arrived. And before I go any further, we obviously need to give our honorable mentions, champions that could have very easily made this list. And with Tech class, there is quite few of them, because we do have a very kind of like solid list of Tech champions that all are good or amazing for specific things that they do, or under specific circumstances, or specifically for certain game modes that, you know, far excel than even some of the champions that I mentioned on the list. One of them will be Captain America Sam Wilson, a brand new addition. Now he's not as new as, you know, some of the latest ones. It's not like he came out a month ago. But at the same time, he is a fresh champion that, you know, I do believe has all of the opportunities in the world to increase his kind of popularity and standing with the players as he becomes more available. Punisher 2099, I think more and more people are kind of starting to realize how great he is. He actually made it to my Battlegrounds deck for several metas as well. And in general, he's just much more powerful than a lot of people realize. And if you do max out Color Tech Mastery, then you basically can spend the entire fight without giving opponent a single bar of power, which in itself is amazing amount of utility. Sentinel, one of the true robot overlords that we had initially, has, you know, slipped back a bit. Still a great champion in my mind. I still have very fond memories of how, even though I didn't particularly like the champion, I ended up relying on him in virtually every chapter of Act 6 Exploration, and he just always seemed to be one of those champions that might not be the one that you want to use, but the one that kind of like does the job for you. Unfortunately, not on the top 10 list. And now I will need to talk a bit more specifically about a couple of champions. Well, it did not include Mysterio and Howard the Duck, even though I do think that both of them have plenty of potential as well. But number one, we need to talk specifically about Visions, because I was fully ready to embrace the comeback of Vision and Vision Age of Ultron to the game much more than it happened. Because when we saw Summoner Showdown, they were using different ranking systems, obviously with different node combinations as well. And it seemed like then, in last year's Summoner Showdown, Vision is going to be unstoppable force in Battlegrounds, which never really materialized. And that is just down to the fact that his damage is just not enough. The way the points are scored in Battlegrounds basically kind of meant that even if you do use Vision as a perfect counter, you have a perfect fight and you don't make a single mistake and you land every parry and every intercept, don't take any block damage, opponent doesn't throw a single special attack, more often than not, you still ended up losing the fight just because you took so much longer than many other champions did in the game mode. So, we're going to see how the Battlegrounds progress, because that was kind of like the best chance the Vision had to stake his claim for fame, so to speak. And other than that, obviously, we haven't seen an increase in Visions being used at all. So it entirely, again, will depend on the scoring system, I think, in Battlegrounds, just like it will with several other champions. But Vision was kind of like a perfect example of people theorizing and hype building up for the champion before it had the opportunity to materialize. And when the game mode actually arrived, nothing really came of it, which is a bit of a shame. And another champion that I did have on the top 10 list, but I do not at the moment, is Solar Centurion. And, well, first of all, it's due to arrival and increase in competition of some newer champions, but also because I haven't really seen Silver Centurion virtually anywhere. I know that there are some people that absolutely advocate and stand by him. I personally think he's quite a cool character as well. If I happen to awaken mine, I'd probably try to sig him up and rank up him at some point as well. But he's, for me, just not quite visible, not high profile enough to be in the top 10 list. And the last champion that I have to mention is going to be Starking Hand Spider-Man. Starking Hand Spider-Man did not make it into top 10, even though this time around I was considering it very strongly. And let me be absolutely honest. If I would be using Battlegrounds as the main kind of argument for these champion rankings, he would be in that list. He would probably be in like top 5 list of must-have rank ups. Because he's crazy. For Battlegrounds, I think all of the metas, with the exception of Safeguard, he was just shredding. He was one of the deadliest attackers. And it was enough to make me kind of acknowledge. As a lot of people know, I have never been a big fan of Starking Hand Spider-Man. I had the 5-star, obviously, since he pretty much came out, and I never bothered to take my 5-star to rank 5. That should kind of like, let you guys know exactly what I think or thought of Starking Hand Spider-Man. But specifically in Battlegrounds, he definitely kind of made me start respecting him much more. In rest of the game modes, I still can't really name a very great reason why you would want to use Starking Hand Spider-Man above Ghost or Ultron or whoever else. There's plethora of champions that I would think are more useful. But specifically for Battlegrounds, where the speed matters, where the damage output matters, where that assisted evade can be absolutely a huge deal, where taunt matters more, helping you to have faster fight. He's just an absolute beast. So if you are somebody that focuses on Battlegrounds, then definitely keep that in mind and know that Starking Hand Spider-Man is an absolute must-have offensive champion to have, in my opinion. Right, let's get to the actual rankings, and somewhat lower is going to be Hallowster. I still think Hallowster is criminally underutilized by a huge portion of the MCOC community. And Hallowster is one of those low-key, hard-working champions. Some of the cooler things that he does, he actually heals from Liquid Courage Double Edge, which is low-key amazing, because obviously he can have this persistent healing without having a need to be awakened or even getting low to health. So he plays extremely well with or without recoil 3 masteries. Then on top of that, obviously access to shock, access to quite decent power control. There are some skill requirements to using this champion, especially when you are trying to learn how to reliably throw your special attacks in a block, which is a requirement, and which is another thing that, more and more champions kind of require, this assault on opponents' blocks. But at the same time, unblockable special attacks, easy access to armor break, shocks, some power control. Opponent's ability accuracy reduction is low-key much more capable than a lot of people think it is, because typically you're gonna have 2 armor ups for vast majority of the fight, which means opponents have 40% reduced offensive ability accuracy, and it's kind of reverse version of spending entire fight of disorient, mirror image on the opponents, which can come in play quite frequently. Not to mention, if you do get the lower health pool, get additional armor ups, and then your opponents will lose virtually all of their offensive abilities altogether. On top of that, obviously, he's extremely tanky. He has access to great amount of damage, and he always played second fiddle to Ultron to me, which is absolutely no shame, because Ultron is an absolute maniac when it comes to clearing content. But what was the most important thing? That he kind of seemed to work in the matchups that Ultron doesn't, or that some of the other robots you tag along don't. For instance, Ultron is notoriously useless in bleed immune matchups. Then you can always bring in Hallowster and clear everything that you need clearing there. Also, there are nodes that specifically punish robots, and there are champions that specifically punish robots. And at that point, again, Hallowster can take on those tasks and those challenges. And in general, he's just one of those champions that I think does what he needs to do when things need to be done. He's not the most popular AQ or AW champion, I fully acknowledge that. He can be very useful in Battlegrounds. I actually did use him in my deck as well on several occasions, because one of the low-key cool things is obviously that unless opponent is shock immune, they will be taking some shock damage, and that will, you know, result in guaranteed health loss. So that was like one of the little sneaky things that you could do with him on Balingdons as well. But again, offensively, his power control, his great damage output, access to armor break, which again is becoming more and more important debuff to have. And yeah, here we are. I am starting this list off with Hallowster. Again, I'm sure that there will be people who do not think Hallowster is as good as I do. However, I have genuinely spent a ton of time using this guy. I've had him rank 3 forever, and he has proved himself to be useful in a ton of different game modes, a ton of different contents in the game. Largely, again, in a context of as a teammate of Ultron. You know, I don't often bring in Hallowster just by himself, but I often have Hallowster on my team because I bring in Ultron, and whenever that happens, he always just kind of somehow manages to prove himself in there. It's kind of like when you run Ghost with Wasp and Hood, and then realize that Wasp and Hood can do a ton of things by themselves as well. Right, moving on, spot number 9, and that is going to be Nebula. Now, Nebula is, again, one of those stories where she was always good, but not quite good enough for majority of the player base to notice her. Then she got buffed, and everybody immediately, you know, was, oh my god, she's the best thing ever to happen to everyone. You know, that's, you know, the second coming of Christ in form of a blue android. But immediately about a month later, that hype kind of did die down. But as that happened, there were more and more dedicated Nebula users that did bring her to forefront, that showcase that she can and is one of the Alliance War MVPs, for instance. She has gotten more recognition also in Balingdons. There was quite a few high-tier players that did rely on Nebula to counter several robots or just to nuke opponents down with a single level 2. And there are more and more players overall just recognizing that she does have a very sturdy base. As I said in the previous video 6 months earlier, that I do wish that her buff included another way how she could gain her tech charges aside from charging heavy attack or throwing level 3. I think if you finished a combo with a medium or something like that and gain a charge, that would have gone a very, very, very long way in helping Nebula to improve drastically as a champion. But even with her kit as is, with her 3 immunities, which again is already, very useful trait in itself, she did get a chance to prove her power lock and power control abilities as well in, I believe, the Dormammu fight in Eternity of Pain. And then obviously we all recognize that crazy shock damage potential. She's a champion that I myself have taken to rank 3 specifically for Alliance War reasons, and I have used her fair amount throughout the latest season. She isn't like a mainstay staple for Alliance War attack, at least for me, but she definitely is capable of absolutely tearing through a ton of Alliance War fights as well, which I do personally think most of the value lies with her. That being said, she also has a very, very cool questing setup with Proxima and Guillotine 2099, Warlock, and another champion, where you just have like an immediate access to a ton of damage, which is quite fun. She's kind of a questing cheese champion too. Right, moving up, slightly improving position. Slightly improving the position. Wait, did I? Thought I swapped them around. 1 second. I just need to double check something. Because I did think, yep. It's not Penny in number 8. In number 8 I'm putting in Guardian, because I did swap them the last moment. I just forgot to make the note. So in spot number 8 we have Guardian. Whoopsie. My bad. I'm back. That's a technical issue there. Right, so Guardian's still extremely valuable champion. Now, obviously, one of the biggest downsides to Guardian is that in order to access his full utility, you quite literally have to have him at Sig 200. Especially because of this energy resistance curve, where last 20 signature stones give you more benefit than previous 60 or 80 signature stones. And I always hate when Kabam does this extremely curved signature scaling, which basically means that majority of those signature stones don't really give you much benefit until you get to the very end. And that's the case with Guardian. However, all of his kit put aside, he definitely has one of the most impressive packs of utility that includes taunt, that includes power control, that includes shock damage, ability, you know, not to ever crit. Then on top of that, you have a ton of resistances to bleed and the energy damage and increased block proficiency, obviously, critical damage resistance, and he is an absolute tank. If I would have a couple of criticisms, then I do think that the way he generates charges could be slightly improved. I do think it's fairly slow naturally, and that whole level 1, level 2 thing is not the coolest thing. However, it is working well enough for him to be a legitimately great Battlegrounds champion, offensively and defensively, obviously, because he is quite hard to kill because he can auto-block tons of opponents' special attacks, which, you know, prevents him from taking huge chunks of damage at a time, which prevents, you know, presents a puzzle for opponents to solve. And at the same time, if you do like your level 1, level 2 in Battlegrounds, it typically is enough to nuke virtually everybody. He's also a champion, however, that does require quite a bit of in-game knowledge. He's a champion that does require you to know which opponents have what type of resistances and stuff like that, because quite often he will not work anywhere near as well as, for instance, a champion that could crit and stuff like that. So you need to be very, very aware of which matchups he is good for and which ones he isn't. Like opponents have shock immunity, for instance, he drastically drops his damage output because his extra damage is always tied to shock damage, not the direct damage, so on and so forth. So there's plenty to learn about the Guardian, but once you do, he is a utility powerhouse and can't be denied. Right, and in spot number 7 now, slightly improving her position from 6 months ago, that is going to be Penny Parker. And Penny Parker has been growing on me much more and more. Now, I know that ever since she was released, there were some people like Jabarby, who were absolute huge mega fans of Penny Parker, whilst everybody else was very busy hating on Penny Parker. And I will, you know, kind of count myself in that group. Like, legitimately, I think of every single champion that exists in game, I dislike fighting Penny the most. Not because I think she's necessarily the hardest. I understand how to fight Penny, you know, obviously. I fought her a ton in Battlegrounds. I didn't ban her virtually ever because I kind of like wanted to learn and wanted to face that challenge of, you know, beating Penny as effectively as I can. And that also gave me, you know, several surprise realizations. For instance, when Fintech absolutely shredded Penny Parkers with Massacre, that was cool. Then I learned that Silver Surfer can absolutely destroy Penny. Now we're going to have Hulkling that is, you know, absolute hardcore direct counter to Penny Parker. Starking Hand Spider-Man destroys this fight very quickly as well in context of Battlegrounds. So there are counters to her. I don't mean by any means that she's, you know, the most annoying champion to face. But I really do actively dislike the idea that her defensive abilities are based on. I really hate when Kabam does the opponent's true strike and true accuracy and true sense effects suffer 100% ability accuracy. You know, if they add in one of these, fair enough, but virtually like, all of the true effects minus 100% ability accuracy. Her auto block, immune to ability accuracy modification, and so on and so forth. I really do think it's just a cheap, lazy, unimaginative way how to design champions, make all the champions, you know, useless, and just, you know, you basically create counters to counters, and once you start doing that, there is no end to it. Once you start doing that, you can effectively start just naming champions. You know, this champion bypasses her abilities, and, you know, she ignores all of the abilities that, you know, these champions have. It's just a silly way to think, because it's clearly extremely manipulative, and Kabam is just breaking their own in-game rules, so to speak. And I really don't like when they do that. Unfortunately, they have started doing that with more and more champions. You know, where random abilities cannot be affected by ability accuracy reduction, when they are immune to specific, you know, debuffs, whenever we have tech champions who rely on armor or buffs, but if those armor or buffs get nullified, then they are passives and things like that. I just think it's lazy. I don't want this game to be going in that direction. All that else being said, now that my mini rant is over, I do think that she has underestimated power control abilities on her level 1, given that her level 1 doesn't grant any power to opponent on the first hit, and then, you know, drains a bit and kind of has that interesting dance that she has to perform of getting opponents under and over power bars. But then you also have access to power burn, which is quite potent. Obviously, she has that nuke level 2. Level 3 has quite potent power control as well. Whenever you run Penny, you realize that auto block offensively can serve quite decent purpose as well, because you can use it as a very, very good failsafe, and you can use it to quickly get rid of opponent's power in a pinch if need be as well. Always love champions that gain some extra power on parries, or, you know, have some sort of mechanic that lets you gain extra powers, like Blade, for instance, where you can just parry opponents and get to level 2. Always like niche abilities like that. And obviously then she has poison and incinerate immunity, which is also super useful. The kind of like biggest, one of the bigger offensive weaknesses that I think about Penny Parker is that she's one of those champions that immediately turns utterly useless when you face somebody that's incinerate immune. And specifically with incinerate, it is quite often the case that when you need incinerate immunity, then opponents also are incinerate immune. So there are more matchups where this comes into play than it would be with, like, you know, bleed debuff or poison debuff or something like that. With incinerate, it specifically seems that the champions that inflict incinerate are largely incinerate immune themselves, therefore they are horrible matchups to each other, which, you know, Penny kind of suffers from as well. But that being said, I still absolutely love her Awakened abilities. Party piece was one of the coolest things in Battlegrounds as well to kind of fully pull off, and that is whenever you face Nick Fury, you can completely shut down Nick Fury's second life with her Awakened ability. And that was one of my favorite plays in general, where I draft Penny Parker, opponent drafts a perfect counter to Penny, but then I end up using her offensively, and they're left with that counter in the hand. So it's just an awesome thing that she can do. And she's much better offensively than a lot of people realize. Right, now to spot number 6. And at spot number 6, I am still going to be putting in the tech champion that I actually can't stand. A tech champion that I really don't like. And that is not a commentary on how good of a champion she is at all. She's clearly amazing champion. Doesn't crit, can heal, can power control, has access to immunities, you know, and obviously insane damage potential. She always proves her worth despite me rooting against her. You know, some of the Happy McMuffin fights that he submitted for the Eternity of Pain challenges were insane, where you can do Eternity of Pain fight with like a 2-star or a 3-star. I think it was 3-star. And then on top of it all, obviously, she still performs virtually everywhere. Again, the only thing where she isn't particularly great at that's relevant right now in the game would be the Battlegrounds. You know, again, but I'm not holding that against her at all, because, again, as I said, not every champion can and has to be amazing for Battlegrounds. She's still an incredibly powerful champion. Now, she's never, ever going to be a champion that I enjoy playing. I have ranked her up, I have played her a ton, and that idea where you have to stop using your special attacks mid-fight if you want to carry on your ramp-up, for instance, always was extreme. I don't mind the fact that you can't lose your combo meter, you can get her awakened, you can drop your heavy attacks, you can have all that. But the biggest problem always in my head is the way it makes me feel whilst playing her, and thinking, can I throw this special attack, or do I need to save up for level 3? Am I allowed to do this or not? And that simultaneously means that some point in the middle of the fight, you often need to sacrifice your utility, which, well, some of your utility, which is either power control on your level 1s or your heal reversal on level 2s, to start building to that level 3. Now, if she had, you know, a generic way of maintaining 100 charges that wasn't level 3, if it said finish the fight with any special attack, for instance, or finish a fight with a heavy attack or something like that, or do something throughout the fight that could also give you the ability to convert those charges, that would be great. However, the way she exists right now, No, she's definitely never going to be a champion for me. That being said, again, still realize how awesome she can be for Alliance Quest. It's been a while since we saw her in Alliance War, but she definitely has put in work in, plenty of questing scenarios. And overall is just one of those champions that's extremely, extremely good to have access to. Because when push comes to shove, she is the character, or one of the characters that kind of come through for you and do some incredibly, incredibly difficult fights. And there is a ton of respect to be placed on that. So even though I will never be, in love with this character or something like that, or she's never going to be the champion that I ever choose to use for fun or something like that, I respect her. I do think she's a very, very powerful champion. I do think she's well put together champion. And she does have plenty going on for her. And it's, pretty much undeniable. Moving on, spot number 5, and that is a newcomer. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how the game plays out when Omega Sentinel becomes much more available, whether, a lot of people still carry on using her, or she's just benefiting from that new champion hype. However, in my own personal experience, I do have Omega Sentinel at rank 3 at the moment, and I do think she's awesome. I have used her in several different game modes already. She does have a fairly interesting ability kit that most importantly doesn't directly overlap with the other most popular tech champions. And that is exactly the type of thing that helps the champion to maintain relevance and be quite important. For instance, she's the only competitively viable tech champion that's immune to Nullify. The only other tech champion is Civil Warrior, but it's Civil Warrior. And that Nullify immunity, again, immediately provides her a ton of utility in plenty of different tricky matchups, be that Buffet, be that Power Snack, be that against a ton of Mystic champions, so on and so forth. Then on top of that, the fact that she bypasses Miss, and she's the only top tech champion that has the ability to bypass Miss. Like, nobody else, I think, in the entire top 10 list of tech champions has the ability to bypass Miss. Then on top of that, obviously, she has the other pre-fights that let her place heal block, gives access to cover this, and she has her shock and, incinerate and plasma debuffs. And, her whole auto block mechanic and all that other stuff. She does come together quite well as a champion. She's not the easiest champion to use. Also, quite unique interactions with Bleed and Poison, where she's a robot. She doesn't benefit from willpower, but she's also not technically immune to Bleed and Poison, which is a very interesting way how to deal with those debuffs, but that can give her some very potent healing. So in some matchups, she's a regeneration machine as well. And then obviously, I don't think a lot of people understand how potent those armor buffs are, because those armor buffs effectively give her 9,500 armor rating based on top of her base armor rating, which isn't the greatest, but you get close to 10,000 armor rating with her, which virtually destroys any incoming damage that isn't critical. And then on top of that, if she's awakened and high sig, she also gains incredibly huge amount of energy resistance. She can increase her damage and all that other good stuff. So there is a ton of utility, as I mentioned. It's going to be interesting to see exactly how relevant she is as a top tier champion. And, let's call a spade a spade. It's obvious that she is going to have some sort of presence in the top tier game because of her prestige. Having that high prestige virtually automatically means that a lot of talented, competitive, veteran players will try to acquire her, and have been trying to acquire her, will rank her up to the highest rank possible. And once you do that, any champion who benefits from that has much, much, much more ability to actually be kind of discovered, used, and be made popular. Obviously, whether the champion can stay there is still gonna have to be seen. But as for myself, I have been quite happy with my Omega Sentinel thus far, for sure. Moving on to spot number 4, slightly lower this time around, and spot number 4 is Ultron. And I still understand that Ultron suffers from that snobby player attitude where champions get buffed, and more often than not, if a champion has been a dud for years, it takes quite a long time for people to fully understand how powerful those champions are. You know, similar things happen to Magneto, where initially people, Magneto is not that good right now, or, you know, Kingpin and Mallman, where for the first half a year, it's like, Mallman still sucks, you know, these 5 champions are that much better. Well, no, you know, they are literally some of the top champions in their respective classes right now. And I do think that a lot of people still kind of tend to underestimate Ultron just because he's an old champion that has been in the game for a while and has sucked in a game for a while. But when you look at him, you know, the results kind of speak for themselves. Obviously, Ultron has gone since that patch adjustment where he can't infinitely stack his level 3 damage, which, in my opinion, did not change his value at all, outside of like Labyrinth and Abyss. I never did it anyways. And in virtually all of the other content, he's just an absolute monster. And he's the champion that combines a very solid amount of utility to just crazy amount of damage. His damage output, when played properly, is just absolutely bonkers. It is up there with the best of them. Quite literally, I think Hercules side by side when I had rank 3 Hercules and rank 3 Ultron, and they either did the fight in the same time or Ultron even slightly kind of overtook Hercules, but obviously that was like the first fight where Hercules needs to be ramped up. What I'm trying to say is, the man has the damage, and the man has 2 immunities, and the man has regeneration, and the man's most of his abilities are immune to ability accuracy reduction. Then on top of that, there is that evade, which can save your ass, can be annoying, you kind of have to get used to it. Also, guaranteed stun on level 1 often makes him a very, very viable option for a ton of stun loops. Access to a ton of debuffs, degeneration or bleed obviously provides him ability to deal with many nodes that would somehow mitigate the damage in itself. Has some power control in level 3, but let's face it, it isn't necessarily the most potent power control. But at the same time, it's just quite hard to deny that whatever he does extremely well. And specifically, he blitzes through content like nobody's business. He was one of the MVPs for virtually every single chapter of Act 7. He's a very viable option for AQ. Haven't seen him used that much in AW. He's also a decently good option for Battlegrounds. And still extremely relevant. And for many people, their current favorite champion to play. And again, full disclosure, I absolutely enjoy using Ultron as well. Whenever I do see a quest path, for instance, or that, you know, requires me to use a tech champion, Ultron is more often than not the champion that I will want to go with. Because I think in generic circumstances, Ultron is, you know, maybe with the exception of Ghost, the quickest and the most effective tech champion when it comes to damage dealing, where you can just blitz through everything. And obviously, also when push comes to shove, all of the utilities that I mentioned about him previously still put in plenty of work. And his signature ability, I didn't even mention that, but his signature ability also can be quite useful if you do happen to have him high sig. Spot number 3 is going to... Now we're going to start the real fights. Now is where the show is going to begin. So spot number 3. And spot number 3 is Warlock. Now, Warlock, for ages, has been spot number 2 tech champion. He was about as stable number 2 in the class as you could find. Warlock is the champion just that happened to be amazing. That's how I typically describe him. Especially remembering when Warlock was first released, tons of content creators, you know, clearly preferred Sunspot, and there was commentary among the lines of, you know, these months, you know, it's quite clear which of these champions has been Kabam's favorite and which one's going to be more useful. Well, it again turned out that Warlock was kind of like a diamond in the rough or something. Because when you read through Warlock's abilities and when you use him in like a casual fight where you could bring in CGR and stuff like that, you don't really see anything too special about Warlock. You know, he has his infections that don't do all that much, and especially if opponent isn't regenerating, they hardly do anything at all, just reduce slightly their offensive ability accuracy. And then on top of that, you know, you have bleed on heavy attacks. You know, it's not like some sort of mega bleed, but, you know, neat. So some shock on your level 1. Some armor breaks on your level 2. There's no furies, no big damage multipliers, like nothing like that. Then once you start using him, obviously, you start from the base that he has bleed, poison, cold snap, and frostbite immunity, which obviously is already quite helpful, but, you know, that's standard for robots. And then, you know, he has access to armor up, which enables him to deal with several nodes that require armor buffs and enable him dealing with, you know, Havoc, for instance, which at the time and still is potentially a troublesome fight. Then it turns out that whenever you face any game mode that you have to play against actual players who have mastery setups, virtually all of them are running willpower, and all of a sudden that virus infection thing is like the best power control in the game, quite openly, and he can power control virtually everybody. And then on top of it, obviously, his damage turns out to be better than people expected. On top of all of that, his, you know, level 2 can pack a plenty of punch, even though he has the most disappointing final hit of level 2 of every champion in the game. When he winds back with that big head hammer and hits and nothing happens, it just is such a letdown. And then obviously additional power control in level 1, level 3 to finish off a magnificent tech champion. And he is all of those things still right now. He's a champion whose power gets virtually multiplied whenever you are fighting against other people. Because then his most powerful abilities just automatically get enabled that would otherwise be restricted for specific nodes or specific opponents. That being said, even without that power control and degeneration that he inflicts with his infections, still all of the immunities, access to shock, bleed, armor break, and ton of power control already, you know, pieced together. Very solid of a champion. He's a champion that just happened to have every single bit of right utility needed for competitive play. He still is one of the best Alliance War offensive champions, in my opinion. He still is one of the best utility Swiss Army knives in the game, and one of the most reliable champions. I think absolutely not even a single mark or single grade less of him than I thought before. It's absolutely bonkers. The problem is the effect that spot number 2, Nimrod, has had to the game. Nimrod works in a similar fashion, kind of like Human Torch does, except obviously he does have more advantages in many aspects. First things first, he absolutely destroys every mutant in the game with the possible exception of Bishop. Then it really depends what type of Bishop you're going up against, because when Kabam made Bishop, there was Devil possessing whoever worked on it. That is the work of the evil. But Bishop aside, Nimrod destroys every mutant with a single level 2 in any kind of like meaningful content. It's quite ridiculous how potent that level 2 can get and how quickly you can amp it up fully against mutant champions. And then obviously we have additional champions and nodes that inflict, you know, enable opponents to get prowess and regeneration effects that significantly help Nimrod in different matchups that aren't necessarily against mutant champions. But as it turns out, once you get more used to using Nimrod, even in a regular matchup where he doesn't gain anything extra, he's still an absolute monster. And the best way to do it typically then is to go for your level 1 just as you are about to change your protocols, because that will grant you 2 charges instead of 1, plus it will enable you to get energize and energy vulnerability, at which point Nimrod's gonna start doing way more damage. And then by the time you get level 2, you will be in Eradicate, and you know that level 2 is likely going to melt any, you know, opponent or reasonable opponent. And if your Nimrod is high sig, most of the time, you, even if that level 2 didn't finish up the fight, you can get back up to your level 2 extremely quickly, thanks to your Energize, and drop another level 2 in no time. It does take a bit of getting used to, but the total kit of Nimrod is just incredibly impressive. I know for a fact he's one of the most wanted champions for virtually every player that doesn't have him. Just because of how simple, easy, and laughable he makes many tough matchups in the game and fights. He's one of the champions, you know, to be very well aware of that they exist in a game. And that is how you can often spot a game-changing champion. When Corvus was dominating the game, Corvus effectively determined how people make Alliance War defense. And, you know, then similar things happened with the next champion, with the next. Human Torch gained popularity, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of champions could not be placed on defense anymore because of Human Torch, or you had to place them on very specific nodes. And Nimrod is that. Nimrod is one of those champions that you absolutely 100% must be aware of, because there is a fairly significant subset of champions that Nimrod just walks through with virtually zero possibilities of losing that fight. Because of his tankiness, because of his immunities, and because of everything else. Like, he's just that dominant. And that's why Nimrod is the second champion right now in the game. There are obviously downsides and weaknesses of the champion, some inconveniences that you need to learn to play around. One of the coolest things that I do like about Nimrod that I haven't mentioned at the moment, though, is the fact that he has very potent power control that opponents activate whenever they use their special attacks. And if you're in Eradicate mode, obviously you benefit from the power lock and from the cowardice. And that's also a neat way how to let opponents stack debuffs on themselves for a fairly decent long time. And they persistently kind of remain there. So Nimrod's power control, I think, is one of the most underestimated aspects of him, because it definitely does help you counter nodes like Spite or some other power control abilities. But then on top of it all, obviously, just the pure destruction that level 2 brings is absolutely beautiful to watch. And that is Nimrod. Absolutely insane maniac that looks like Jigglypuff, that just shreds the game at the moment. No regrets for taking that guy to rank 4 at all. And still the top tech champion in the game. And, you know, full disclosure, I still believe the top champion in the game is Ghost. Since Quake is not included in these lists, because all of these lists only count champions that are available as 6 stars, I do think that currently, for all of these ranking purposes, Ghost is still the best tech champion, still the best champion in the game. And she reminded us exactly that because of Battlegrounds. You know, as soon as Battlegrounds came, as long as it wasn't Safeguard meta, she was shredding people. That's one. Second thing, there's a very good reason why she is still one of the most popular bans in Alliance Wars, because she shreds Alliance War fights. And then obviously, just the pure fact that you can feel whenever new content gets designed, whenever new quests are made or challenges are made, Kabam has to work around Ghost. They have to keep making, you know, nodes that Ghost can't deal with. They have to shove that armor break in virtually every fight, or some sort of other abilities that, you know, prevent Ghost from being used. And I do have a feeling that just like Kabam likely puts everything through Quake test, or a very significant portion of their new content, even though Quake would have to be a 5-star when used, Kabam is probably putting everything through Ghost test as well these days. Because if you can bring in Ghost, slap that hood on the Synergy team, and if you want Wasp as well, why not? If you want to be extremely cheeky, add in Ant-Man and Odin, add those pre-fights, and you can just turbo through anything. But, you know, I don't think I have to talk a lot about Ghost. You know, if you're playing MCOC, you should be well aware of what Ghost is capable of at this point. I do think whoever designed her is a bit of a mad scientist. I do think that, you know, the biggest over-the-top OP thing was that they decided to let her not only purify every single damage over time debuff in the game, but then also convert them into very powerful Fury attacks. I'm like, what the fuck is up with that? Like a Fury passive that's 3,800, so each of those Fury passives is virtually 100% of her base attack. And obviously guaranteed crit, super easy way to bypass away, all that other stuff. I still think Ghost is the best champion in the game. Like, the champion to have when clearing all of the content in the game considered. You know, she destroys any variant where she can be used reliably. She destroyed any story content where she could be used reliably. She destroys more than her fair share of, you know, challenge modes and, you know, competitive stuff like that comes up. And then obviously all the alliance modes she's crazy for. She's crazy for battlegrounds yet again in majority of the metas. And as long as she exists in game, she's gonna carry on doing it. Again, it's very, very hard to imagine any future version of MCOC where Ghost is not one of the most powerful champions. I'm not saying that, you know, there couldn't be somebody that's overall more impressive, even though I do think that would be virtually game-breaking yet again. And I do think that it's not good for a game to receive more characters as strong as Ghost overall, because she's just bonkers. Anyhow, that will be it for today's video. So I will drop down the new ranking list here. So we do have Ghost spot number 1, Nimrod is 2nd now, Warlock in 3rd, Omega Sentinel 4th, Ultron 5th, Guillotine 2099 6th, 7th Penny Parker, 8th is Guardian, 9th Nebula, 10th is Hallowster. Honorable mentions would be Starkenhand, Spider-Man, Solar Centurion, Mysterio, Punisher 2099, Sentinel, and War Machine. I think that gets the most of them. Anyways, we finally got through it. Took us a while. Back tomorrow with a list for science class. See you guys. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about